Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Raffaello Pantucci. I'm a senior fellow at the International Center for Research on Political Violence and Terrorism Research. And I apologize, it's a bit of a mouthful. And it's very early in the morning here in Singapore, but thank you all for joining us this morning for this webinar, looking at where do things stand in Afghanistan, and where do we stand on the war on terror these days. I am delighted this morning to be welcoming you to this webinar, which is part of a series that we've been running at ICPVTR at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, which is trying to explore the consequences of the American announcement of withdrawal from Afghanistan on the sort of broader trends of international terrorism. And we've had sessions in the past looking at this from a Pakistani perspective, an American perspective, and we're really delighted and honored this morning that we are joined by former Ambassador Omar Samad, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. So in fact, it's good evening, Ambassador Omar. We're delighted that you're able to join us today to talk about this important question and what really is a pretty pivotal moment in, I think, Afghanistan's recent history. Ambassador Omar Samad was a long-standing diplomat in the Afghan diplomatic service, rising to serve in the position as Ambassador to France, Ambassador to Canada, and also Ambassador designate to Belgium and the European Union at various moments in his time. He also served a number of time for some time in Kabul as a senior advisor to the chief executive of Afghanistan, Mr. Abdullah, who is deeply involved in, as we know, all the negotiations we see happening at the moment in Kabul. So the purpose of today's discussion is to try to dig into what's happening in Afghanistan, where we see things going next, and understanding a little bit more what the kind of broader trends and what the impact of this will all be on the more broad war against international terrorism that was really the reason that the West went into Afghanistan in the first place. To quickly go through the format for today's session, the format will be that myself and my colleague Abdul Basit, who is a senior fellow also at our ICPVTR, will ask some questions to Ambassador Omar to cover the first sort of half hour or so of the discussion. And then we'll throw it open to questions from the audience. What we would like, the way we're going to take the questions is via the chat function. So let me please encourage you to type into the chat box any questions you may have. Feel free to put them in at any moment. And then what we'll do is we'll put them to him as we see them sort of come in. But that will be the format. We will sort of guide all the questions through the sort of chat box. So if you have anything, please put them in there. And then at the end, my colleague Basit will close us out. So that is the format for this morning's event, or this evening's event for Ambassador Omar. And so I think, to get us going, Omar, let me start with quite a broad question to sort of set the scene a little bit. So from your perspective, where do things stand now, as opposed to when we saw the United States first going in 2002 in the wake of the terrible terrorist attacks in Washington and New York in 2001?
Well, thank you so much, Raffaello. Thank you. Good morning to you and to Abdul Basit and all your colleagues, and my thanks to RSIS for this invitation. I've done webinars quite often lately in the past year or two, but this is, I think, is the one that is the latest that I've done, and it's because obviously of the time difference that you and I have. 2001 obviously was a historic year in so many ways, but 9/11 I think not only changed the world, the tragedies of 9/11, but it obviously changed the course of events in Afghanistan and the surrounding region as well, up to this day. In order to understand 9/11, because I am one of those people who actually was very much involved prior to 9/11 with Afghanistan issues at the time when the Taliban were in control of about 85% of the country. There was a resistance, active resistance, led by the late Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary commander who had also fought the Soviets in the 1980s, that was hanging on to some territories in Afghanistan. The Taliban were assisted by a slew of different organizations, international terrorist organizations, in different ways, including Al-Qaeda that had been harbored in Afghanistan since around 1996, even though the Al-Qaeda and bin Laden had come to Afghanistan during the Soviet period. And some of us Afghans, few of us, saw the threat before 2009-11 in the form of not just a threat to Afghanistan and to the people of Afghanistan, and what looked to some people as a civil war, even though it was a civil war, but it also was a proxy war, and you had all these different non-Afghan elements involved with different agendas. So Al-Qaeda's agenda was obviously transnational. The Taliban agenda seemed to be national, but at the same time, it was helping transnational organizations. There was very little attention given to what was going on to Afghanistan. And so we were very frustrated before 9/11. People like I were very frustrated by the fact that we realized that there's a dual dimension to what is happening in Afghanistan. The terrorist dimension that goes outside the borders and what is happening to the Afghan people. And we tried to convey that message to the US authorities, to Europeans and others. Masood had traveled to Paris in April of 2001. I happened to go there and meet him and cover his trip to France. And he did warn the West very clearly. He said, if you do not pay attention to Afghanistan and if you do not realize what is happening here, this terrorist threat is going to hurt you and maybe even strike you. So I'm paraphrasing, but this is exactly what he said in Paris. And so we conveyed that, but people were not grasping, not really understanding. Intelligence data that was coming was not able to put the whole picture together or connect the dots. But then 9/11 happened. And then obviously there was a quick reaction. The Taliban were given an ultimatum to turn over bin Laden or face, an assault, which they did. And so the Taliban had a chance at the time to do what the world was asking of them. But for a variety of reasons, some of which is cultural, I think, they felt like they wanted to discuss this issue and then take a legal route to see if bin Laden was actually behind it. So they were playing this game, and the Americans didn't have the patience for it. The international community obviously was standing behind the Americans, including the Russians and Chinese and everybody else, supported the Americans. And on October 7th, if I'm not mistaken, the planes took off. And within days, the Taliban were routed. And a conference was held in Germany to set up a new Afghan administration, bring to the table as many of the stakeholders as possible. This is an important point, with the exception of the Taliban, who had been defeated, but were still around, and another faction under a former warlord and political leader called Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So with the exception of these two main factions, everybody else who mattered at the time was at the table under the auspices of the United Nations and with the presence of most of the region and other stakeholders. And so this is where Hamid Karzai was somewhat selected as the person who would head an interim government. So the fact that the Taliban were not there, and the fact that the Taliban at any moment after 9/11, and even after Hamid Karzai went to Kabul and formed a new government, which is the time when I also went back to Afghanistan and joined this new government, there were many opportunities, and there were even overtures by the Taliban themselves to come and end that phase of animosity and the conflict per se, and basically surrender and agree and be offered an amnesty so that they could return back to their villages and to their country. And most of them lived in Pakistan. at the time. Some of them were in Afghanistan, those who survived. And so Al-Qaeda obviously fled also. Most of them ended up in Pakistan as well, as we know. And some of them actually ended up in Iran. And so as a result, at the time, the Afghan administration, a very young administration with very little experience governing, asked, obviously, or was told by the American administration, by people like Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Cheney and others under Mr. Bush, that there should be no clemency, there should be no negotiations or any type of dealing with the Taliban. Looking back, if we had at that point made some type of effort to actually end that war and that chapter altogether and agree with the Taliban that they can now go and live as normal civilians and citizens of the country and have all the rights, we wouldn't be here today where we are today. I think firmly that we would have had an end to war. Maybe a few sort of radicalized Taliban groups or maybe cells within the Taliban that had ties to international terrorism or to maybe some factions within Pakistan or the region would have broken off and maybe gone their way and formed something. But the bulk of the Taliban, the mainstream Taliban, would have ended the war. Instead, what happened was that we assumed that the war was ended, that we were victorious, and the Taliban had been defeated. Within the next 2-3 years, we set up, we tried to create a new government, a new political order, a new constitution, going towards elections, promising the Afghan people democracy, human rights, women's rights, participation, development, progress, and all of this. State building, nation building, all these beautiful terms. And meanwhile, the Taliban, who had felt that they were disenfranchised somehow, or that they were ignored and felt that they were no longer part of Afghan society, decided, under whatever circumstances we don't know, decided that they were going to make a comeback and that they were going to give it another chance to go and pick up arms and fight again. And so they started this insurgency again, initially from their bases in Pakistan, came back to Afghanistan, and they gathered forces. And that was around 2004, 2005. And that insurgency picked up steam as the Afghan government became weaker over time, and the Afghan government weaker in the sense that it started losing territory bit by bit to the Taliban. It started losing hearts and minds, that concept of hearts and minds. It started, unfortunately, showing very deep signs of corruption, of injustice, of a very weak rule of law, of bad electioneering, undermining democratic rules and regulations, losing the trust of the people over a 15-year period or so, more or less, and eventually turning on its own people and turning against its own people, and using the United States and its allies in this intra-Afghan war, which embroiled the United States, in my opinion, unnecessarily. Whereas what we should have done is either find a solution or we should have let the Americans go and take care of it ourselves. But that's not what happened. I don't want to go into the detail, but I wanted you to, as you mentioned, set the stage for this as to, in my opinion, and in a summarized version, how it started and where we are today.
Excellent, Ambassador Omar, for these initial remarks. Since then, things have changed, as you said, and we are here today where Taliban are back in power. And one thing that we have observed is that they look very PR savvy, and apparently they are exhibiting this pragmatic political approach. So what should we make of this Taliban 2.0? Have they changed? Have they become more extreme? Because we heard that the neo-Taliban or the newer generation, which is the Anas Haqqani Mullah Yaqub generation, is perhaps more extreme. Or are they still the same old Taliban saw from 1996 to 2001? What's your take on this, the PR approach that they're exhibiting?
So this is the million-dollar question that everyone has been asking for at least the last couple of years. Ever since the Americans started negotiating with the Taliban, and ever since they signed a deal on February 29th, 2020, people are asking, are these the same Taliban? Have they changed? Are they just, using gimmicks and it's a PR campaign? My personal view, having studied the Taliban from 1994 till now, I see a mix of some amount of change and adjustment and adaptation to the modern world and to certain aspects of the modern world that serves their purpose, whether it's PR, whether it's technology, whether it's opening up to different countries and traveling and meeting world leaders and talking to the media and so on and so forth. And also the rhetoric that they use has shifted and changed over the years. They are now giving press conferences, doing interviews and taking any type of question thrown at them. And so this is a very real change. The real change, I think, is really and can be assessed and evaluated in two ways. One is in mindset. To what extent has Taliban mindset shifted and changed and evolved over time? And I think that at some level it has. They are now cognizant of the fact that girls need to go to school, but that it has to be done in a certain fashion, taking into consideration certain local, cultural, and Islamic, their interpretation of Islamic rules and regulations. They do agree to women going to work, again, but more of in a segregated manner, whereas in the past they were somewhat adamantly against it and prohibited it. They are okay with women wearing, the hijab and going out. To this point, in the past few weeks in Kabul and other provinces, this has not been a problem. Even today in Herat, I saw a group of Afghan women wearing just the hijab, as they did during Ashraf Ghani's time in Karzai's time, demonstrating, and the Taliban did not disrupt it. And there was another demonstration, interestingly enough, in Kabul today, where pro-Taliban women came out, but they were totally veiled. In an outfit that was somewhat novel and new that I had never seen before, but their own creation, their own innovation, and their own portrayal of what hijab is. But the fact that there were women, pro-Taliban women who came out on the streets of Kabul, basically celebrating their victory. That has never been seen before. So yes, there is a mindset shift. Then the second aspect of this is policy. It has to do with how you translate rhetoric and how you translate these the PR part of it to policy and execution of policy, and at the same time trying to justify it not only to your own people. But also to the international community. And this is where we still don't have enough data, because they just took control of Kabul. They haven't formed the government yet. It's expected to be formed within the next few days. There's an expectation that the government will be broad-based. It will represent different communities. I think, yes, it will represent different communities. You're going to have a multi-ethnic feel to it. But there are a couple of things we know so far that may not happen, We don't know to what level they're going to allow women to be part of the leadership structures. And we do not know, for example, where authority and power is going to reside. Are they going to give some level of authority and power to governors, let's say, or to ministers? Or are they going to have a very centralized system where the final decisions are taken by either a shura or by the supreme leader if they end up with such a system, or by the chief executive that they may appoint. So we don't know those answers yet. We will find those out in the next few days. And so they have a few challenges, a few issues that they need to resolve. We do not also know to what extent they are cohesive within their own ranks, to what extent there are differences of opinion that haven't been sorted out yet, or maybe they have been sorted out and they haven't announced it yet.
That's fascinating. And I think, you've sketched out the complexities of sort of Afghan politics as we see it now, and in particular within the Taliban. And we've talked a lot about sort of what's happening within Afghanistan and how it's changed. But I wonder if we could switch slightly to look a little bit more at the kind of the motivation that we saw when the West first came in to Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, in the wake of the attacks in the United States. And, in sort of Western, I think, policymaking circles and discourse, there is the concern about what happens now to the terrorist threat, and Al-Qaeda in particular. I think Al-Qaeda has been fighting alongside the Taliban for some time. We haven't really seen, I think, a overt split between the two organizations. But what's your sense of what the threat or the reality is of Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan, and what kind of a threat that may or may not pose to the world? And do you think you could see a context of things returning to the situation that we had pre-2001 and the terrorist threat that emanated from Afghanistan in the first place?
Well, this is the other million-dollar question, Raffaello, as to whether the Taliban still have the same level of connectivity to Al-Qaeda as they did back in the 90s, prior to 9/11, or has that also changed and evolved into something different? My personal view and assessment, and looking at the data over the years, and knowing that there are nuances, knowing that there are differences of opinion on this, sometimes very, very harsh differences, where on one hand, it's being claimed that there is no change, that they are organically still connected, that they are following sort of an agenda, a common agenda, that the Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to operate within Afghanistan and use it for whatever reasons, training or recruiting or whatever. And then there's the other mindset that says that has changed. That what we are seeing is a totally different type of relationship. And that there is little connection between the two, that the Taliban are actually apprehensive about it, that they would not like to be associated with Al-Qaeda, that they have learned a lesson from the past, and that they do not want to take risks anymore, and that not only will that impact the relationships with the West, but also will seriously impact the relationship with many countries in the region and the neighbors of Afghanistan, and that there's really they don't gain much. So my view is somewhere more or less in between these two, but leaning more toward the latter. My view is that, first of all, Al-Qaeda is no longer the same kind of organization as it was in the 90s. There is no Al-Qaeda Central anymore. The leadership is no longer managing affairs as they did before. They lost many of their cadres. They are, as Mr. Biden has claimed on several occasions, now somewhat diffused, and they have turned into smaller cells in different countries of the world, from Africa to parts of Asia and the Middle East, of course. That the ISIS, ISIL, ISKP phenomena obviously has also deteriorated Al Qaeda and has become a threat. In some cases, a threat. In other cases, it's complex, as you know. In some parts of the Islamic world, it's a very mysterious type of relationship. In Afghanistan, I don't think that the Taliban, first of all, can afford to allow groups such as Al Qaeda to operate the way that they did back in the 90s. They would lose legitimacy at home and they would lose legitimacy in the region and beyond. They would end up isolated, totally isolated, and they would be a target themselves. What we have, on the other hand, is, and I'm not implying that there is no Al Qaeda. What I'm saying is that there are remnants of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. Some of them have lived in the territories that have been under the control of the Taliban over the past 15 years or so, 20 years. Some of them go back and forth between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But these are not high-level operatives of Al Qaeda. Most of these are older Al Qaeda members who either stayed in Afghanistan because they had nowhere else to go, or they could not. It was too risky to go anywhere else. So it was safer to just go underground in Afghanistan and live a secluded life. Or they married with locals. And so there were intermarriages and Al Qaeda members who then stayed with their new families in Afghanistan and over time distanced themselves from the militancy and the terrorist agenda. Now, are there a few elements of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan who espouse or think that they can recreate what existed? Probably. The question is, will the Taliban allow that to happen? The Taliban have signed a deal with America very explicitly saying that they will not allow Al Qaeda specifically to use Afghanistan, organize itself in Afghanistan, recruit in Afghanistan, and train in Afghanistan for any terrorist purpose and threaten any country, the United States and its allies, or anybody else. And I think that that is probably the understanding that the Taliban have with whatever remnants of Al Qaeda exist in Afghanistan. Are these remnants of Al Qaeda going to go behind Taliban backs and do something that is not desired? Is an open question. I do not know. Are they going to get some help and assistance from certain other organizations that exist in this region and the Pakistan, Afghanistan sort of tribal regions that are very problematic, and all sorts of different organizations, and also some Central Asian organizations that used to have relationships with Al Qaeda in the past, is also an open question. But I think that at this point, as long as the Taliban are seeking legitimacy, they're seeking international assistance, they need international assistance, they're seeking recognition and all of that, that they will not go back to the 1990s formula.
Thank you, Ambassador Omar Samad, for this. One question I have is about this group ISKP, the regional franchise of the Islamic State, and the unfortunate attack at the Hamid Karzai International Airport literally brought them in the limelight, and now the Western media is scratching the surface to know in a deeper sense what the group is about. The group has been around despite all military pressure on them, has shown resilience, and is now positioning itself as the anti-Taliban, so-called true jihadist groups. So how do you see ISKP's threat in Afghanistan? But on a side note, also linked to the previous question of Al-Qaeda growing or not and how Taliban will deal with them, also address this question of different jihadis once again espousing to go back to Afghanistan. I mean, there is media commentary on this. My own view is maybe that won't happen, but how do you look at it? What if various Al-Qaeda leaders, think of going back to Afghanistan and recreate there? You have addressed that may not be possible, but about the possibility of jihadists going back.
So let me, the experience of the last 25 years or so sort of brings up one very critical issue when it comes to such groups trying to find a footprint in Afghanistan. These groups are usually not Afghan groups. The Afghans part of it is either fringe elements or they are dissatisfied elements from another faction that then join these people, or they're individuals who need a livelihood and they need money and they go and do this for a salary. So they usually are cells in groups, in subgroups that come from other countries. In order to come to Afghanistan from other countries, you have only a few options. You cannot be heliported and you cannot be parachuted into Afghanistan. You either have to cross Iran, which is probably improbable because the Iranians obviously are keeping a tight control, and not many of such groups, unless they were Iranian bred, will use Iran to cross the border. They will not be coming from easily coming from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Turkmenistan, unless they were affiliated with, let's say, IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or some other fringe affiliations from the region, or individuals who cross the Amur River or find a certain way to get into Afghanistan and join these groups. Again, very difficult because they are not only under the watchful eye of the Russians and the Central Asians, but also from a topography point of view, it's very difficult. And if occasionally some individuals do, it might happen. Otherwise, it's geographically very difficult to do. The only other country that remains is Pakistan. And so traditionally, historically, as a result of the Afghan jihad or war against the Soviets, this is where most of these groups came and settled in Pakistan, pretending and claiming to support the anti-Soviet campaign. And then they didn't leave. When that campaign ended and the Soviets left, most of these organizations, including Al-Qaeda, for a long time did not leave and stayed until either they were kicked out, of course, or they disappeared in the scenery and in the landscape and ended up running underground organizations or joining local Pakistani organizations. And some of them, in some cases, came into Afghanistan. At the time when the Taliban were there, obviously, they were more receptive of these groups. But if we assume that the Taliban have learned a lesson and they are not going to take that huge risk, a strategic risk, then Pakistan is also going to probably do everything possible to prevent these groups from entering Pakistan and then from crossing into Afghanistan. Unless, again, the Pakistani state feels that some of these elements serve a certain purpose. And, and we can extrapolate this and come up with all kinds of theories and conspiracy theories as to what a country or a state actor might do in order to support or not support a non-state actor. And that becomes very complicated and is driven, obviously, by a lot of different impulses. It involves a lot of intelligence service work. So I'm not going to enter that domain because it's not very clear and transparent. But in my opinion, coming back to ISKP in your initial question, you have to first ask yourself, how did ISKP end up in Afghanistan? When did it end up in Afghanistan? And what was its composition? And what is its composition now? And what agenda are they pursuing? ISKP emerged in Afghanistan around 2014-15. I was in Kabul at the time, and so we were watching this phenomena very closely. There were all kinds of different theories about it as to how they ended up in Afghanistan. It was an offshoot, of course, of the Middle East corporate IS. But it very quickly took a very local flavor. Some Pakistani Taliban, TTP elements joined it. Some radical Afghan Taliban elements joined it. Elements from Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups that were in the vicinity also may have joined it. Because they were offering a new vision, a new brand. They seemed to be somewhat rich and had more money to play with, and they espoused the idea of a khilafat, a caliphate, which is very different from the notion of an emirate that the Taliban espouse. So one main difference between these two organizations is the khilafat versus the emirat. And this is where they also not only differ on it, but they also have a very different outlook on how Islamic governance should be executed, and who the enemy is, the immediate enemy and the long-term enemy. So in all of these areas, there are differences between groups such as the Taliban and ISKP. This is why they've been fighting each other for the past 5-6 years. And ISKP may have, at the highest level of its existence in Afghanistan, may have had about 2,000 members, very ferocious and brutal, as we have seen in the Middle East as well, and not welcomed by the local population. They only had a presence in 2 small districts in Afghanistan, one in the north, which was eliminated after a while. And some of their recruits were actually brought to Kabul. So those who surrendered to the government or those who were captured were brought to Kabul, and they were imprisoned. We don't know whether they were being used for other purposes. There are some kind of theories that say that some of these people may have been used by other elements for terrorist purposes. And then the ones in the eastern districts have also had diminished influence. They may now number a few hundred. But as you know, all it takes is one person, as we saw the other day at Kabul airport, one suicide bomber to get through and to create mayhem. So I don't think that ISKP is going to be a bigger threat over time. I think that with the Taliban in control, they will feel more pressure, and some of its members may leave this geography and go somewhere else, or they may give up on their cause, or they may join other local organizations in the, again, Afghan, Pakistan tribal regions. They are right now trying to make an imprint and make a statement because the Americans were leaving. But I don't consider them as a long-term threat unless the Taliban have growing internal problems and more of their fringe elements, the fringe Taliban elements, both Pakistani Taliban as well as Afghan Taliban, leave these organizations, and join ISKP and reinforce ISKP. It's a possibility, but with the Taliban in control of Afghanistan, I don't see why such fringe elements at this point would leave and go and become, and become a victim of the Taliban going after them, as well as Americans still who are watching from the sky as to what is happening. And I think that every opportunity that America and their allies in the region might have to strike at groups such as ISKP, they will do it. So ISKP is right now a target and in danger.
So just a quick one on this while we are at this discussion. This discussion of Afghan Taliban as a movement having their divisions, and with some of the more radical elements being uncomfortable with this moderate political pragmatic pitch of the Taliban, and the more jihadist elements, radical elements getting irritated by it, and then seeing ISKP maybe as an alternative. How much of this theory, appeals to you or doesn't appeal to you? Is there a chance of Taliban cracking up as an organization going forward, looking at, they are accepting things they weren't back in the day, and then that benefiting the ISKP? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, as I tried to convey this notion correctly, as you said, I think that the Taliban, like many of these organizations, do have nuances. They have different tendencies within the organization, some ideological, some less ideological, some mainstream, some influenced by outside international organizations, terrorist organizations. And most of the Afghan Taliban somewhat focused on Afghanistan itself. But so these fringe elements, whether ideological or under the influence of international organizations, if they feel uncomfortable, if they think that the Taliban are doing things that is contrary to their belief and their opinion, might break away. I don't see that happening immediately, but it could happen over time. So ISKP could be one magnet, and it could attract some of these elements, but there are many others as well. And don't forget, there are also organizations in this geography that whose cause is focused on Uzbekistan. There's another one that the China says ETIM, which is focused on China. And then you have sectarian groups that are terrorist groups. Who always provoke, the divide between Shia, Sunni, and other subgroups, Islamic subgroups. And you obviously have anti-Pakistan terrorist groups, anti-Pakistan state terrorist groups. You even have anti-Iran groups based in Pakistan, as well as on the other side of the border, you have Sunni groups based in Iran. So it's a very big mix. How the Taliban are going to manage and deal with this situation is going to be watched very carefully, I think. It is going to be a barometer for many in the region. The Taliban, as you know, have gone out of their way in the past few years to try to befriend to the extent possible and to gain trust with Iran, with Russia, and with China. Pakistan already was a supporter, and they had a big network of supporters in Pakistan going back to the 1990s and 80s, even before the Taliban were created. So I think that they are not going to risk that. I think they have invested heavily in having these new relationships, and any type of move to disrupt that and support an organization that would then create a backlash from China or Russia or Iran would really be detrimental to the Taliban.
Thank you for that. I think really fascinating, and I think the discussion around how all these other jihadist groups could stay sort of within within the Taliban's control, or whether they become an opposition, I think is a really interesting one. But then I wonder if we could talk a little bit on the other side of the opposition, because we still see some resistance in the Panjshir Valley. We see, former Vice President Saleh is continuing to sort of present a resistance force, and appears to have some support from across the border in Tajikistan, at least. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how substantial this particular opposition group is, and the others, and what other ones might exist, and whether you see a sort of the same coherent grouping coming together to fight against the Taliban, and whether, you know, how this will sort of interplay with these more extremist jihadist elements that we were just talking about within ISKP, because I suppose you have the potential now for there to be quite a complicated picture. Or do you think that the Taliban are able to, you know, are going to be able to either, you know, counter all this and fight against them, or create enough of a kind of big umbrella that it will sort of bring everybody together? I wonder if you could talk to us about that other side of the kind of opposition. Yeah. Thank you.
So the other position that has emerged in the past few weeks as a result of Ashraf Ghani's sudden departure and the void that was created in Kabul, and the decision by Amrullah Saleh to go and form a resistance front to the Taliban in Panjshir, and then be joined somehow by Ahmad Massoud, the son of the legendary Ahmad Shah Massoud, in the Panjshir Valley, is obviously a cause for concern for the Taliban, because the Taliban claim that now they want full control of the country. They want to bring peace and stability to all of Afghanistan. Then they want to unite all the different factions and ethnic groups, and then maybe give everybody a share of the pie. How they do that technically, and as I said earlier, how power will be shared is a different story. But what they're now facing is obviously an insurgency, something that they used to be a few weeks ago, an insurgency against the then Afghan government. But also it's a reflection of the fact that there are people in Afghanistan who on one hand have a very bad memory of the Taliban from the 90s. And there's bad blood from the 90s. And secondly, in the past 15 years or so, there are also more bad blood because the sort of Afghan civil war never ended. And so it continued with the Taliban re-emerging and then fighting the Afghan army and the new government in Afghanistan were created after 2001. And so you have unresolved issues. Part of it is a bit ethnic in some ways. Part of it is cultural. And it's wanting in Afghanistan that can respect diversity. So they have a point there because they have had bad experience in the past. We have had very bad experience with accommodating all different constituencies within a system. And the Taliban's record is not a very good record. And that's why people are somewhat reluctant and doubtful about it. Obviously, both sides have expressed a desire to resolve this peacefully, but in the past 48 hours, unfortunately, discussions failed over, in my opinion, issues that could have been resolved if they had good mediation and if they could have agreed to a timetable and to a drawn-out solution over 2 or 3 phases. But that did not happen. Both sides stuck to their guns. And over the last 24 hours, and just as we are speaking, there's very heavy fighting going on in and around Panjshir, and as well as the provinces, adjacent provinces. Where is this going to end? I do not know. This could expand if the insurgency is able to provoke more people against the Taliban, or the Taliban will bring in reinforcements and try every means possible to crash it. I again hope that at some point they stop the fighting and that both the Taliban show flexibility and show understanding and actually show the moderate side that they are talking about and agree that Afghanistan is a diverse society and people may not want to live, under just one set of rules that the Taliban would want to impose, that we need to agree on a common set of rules for all Afghans. And so I hope that at some point we reach that stage and they can go back to talking about a roadmap about negotiations, and then bring them into the under the tent, as you said, and hopefully put an end to this. Otherwise, we might see the rekindling of another civil war. I don't know at what scale, what the scale might be, but obviously it will hurt people, and it will also put pressure and challenge the Taliban and their claims for wanting a stable and peaceful Afghanistan. And it may even at some stage get other countries in the region involved. And you mentioned Tajikistan. I'm not sure yet what Tajikistan's policy towards these events is. Clearly right now, they're obviously concerned. They must be very worried. None of Afghanistan's neighbors benefit from instability and continued warfare in Afghanistan. But at this stage, some of the neighbors may also be very uneasy about not knowing what a Taliban-run government will look like and what agenda they may pursue. So, not knowing what Tajikistan's position is, I think the region, if this civil war grows and expands in Afghanistan, it could embroil other countries in the region as well.
Well, thank you for that, and I think we're going to start to pick up some of the questions now from the audience. But so let me re-emphasize to those who are watching: if you do want to ask a question, please just put it into the chat function, and then I'll sort of pick them out and put them to Ambassador Omar as we go along. But to sort of continue on a theme you were talking about there, in some ways about Taliban maturity and the degree to which they're willing to sort of find political compromise, engage, negotiate with some of these other groups to try to bring them into the tent. There is another side to Taliban governance, which is the very practical one. The very practical one of money, the need for resources, the need for having managerial capacity, the need for, technocrats to actually help run ministries. You're talking about a country of, I forget the Afghan population, 40 million or 50 million or something. It's a big population, requires sanitation, education, all these sorts of systems, which, require very strong structures. And what we've seen certainly is, I think, a considerable question around brain drain. Prominent senior Afghans with some experience leaving, people with education saying, well, this isn't for me. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of governance and whether we think that the Taliban are going to be able to deliver this, or whether we think that that's really going to sort of, how are they going to manage the complexities of this and the potential that, the aid spigot might not open up again.
Yes, well, Rafael, we don't have enough proof and data to go by. What we do have is a dismal Taliban record from the 1990s, where we saw that they were not fully capable and they could not recruit or attract technocrats and bureaucrats to come and help, and they could not even attract foreign investment and foreign aid coming to the country. And so the situation back in the 1990s, from 96 to 2001, was pretty dismal and bleak for the Afghans. The country was totally impoverished, and the Taliban governance was very weak and primitive. Now, what has happened since then? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, there has been some evolution. There is some change that we see in the text. They have been, to some extent, the leaders have been exposed to the outside world through technology and social media and their access to the media overall. They're even rank and file, knows what is happening in the world and can see all the images and not live in isolation as they did back in the 1990s. And so So how they are going to govern from here on will depend on a few factors. Number one, on their prioritization of governance objectives. Or do they consider the economy as a primary issue, or do they think that, you know, security and safety is their number one priority? Are they going, or do they realize that Afghanistan is a very dependent country, you know, sort of a rentier state, as some call it, and that it cannot function very well without foreign assistance? Have they calculated and somehow evaluated the situation as to whether they can rely on some countries but not on others, and that would be good enough? There is this notion now that the Taliban, having somewhat normal relations with countries like China, may decide that there is no need for Western contributions to the future of Afghanistan. And then they can point to the fact that in the past 2-3 weeks, all Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and governments like Germany's and the United States and others froze all their assets and cut off all assistance to Afghanistan, with the exception of humanitarian assistance. And then say, well, you know, we're not in a unipolar world, we are in a multipolar world, and we can go to others and seek help there. Is that going to happen? Or are they going to be more broad-minded again and seek assistance from others? If they do, and if that is their strategy, then they will have to take into consideration some of the red lines and some of the expectations that have been vocalized over the past few days by G7 a few days ago, by the governments of Canada and the United States and European Union and others, basically saying that you need to have a broad-based government, you need to have a representative government, you need to have women participate in all fields of life and as well as governance. You need to open the economy, you need to attract investment, you need to engage in trade and transit, and you need to make sure that terrorism does not find a foothold in Afghanistan again, and that you fight and help us fight those elements that we consider as a threat. So all these conditions that we put to them, it's a question of whether they're going to have a broad approach or they're going to have a narrow approach. I cannot give you an answer yet because it's a bit too early and we don't have enough policy decisions on these matters yet.
Thank you. And we've had a whole bunch of questions coming in. A lot of them actually talking about some of the regional powers. And I want to come to that in a second, because I think there's some very interesting relationships and dynamics would be excellent to hear your thoughts about. But maybe to build on that, one question that has been asked is, you know, well, so what can the international community do to try to encourage, let's say, some of the more moderate impulses within the Taliban? Because as you've discussed, you know, the organization, you know, it's clearly changed. It's not what it was previously. And it's within that, there are elements who recognize the needs of, you know, keeping to certain red lines or pushing certain narratives or trying to sort of adapt and grow as an organization to govern the country. And so what do you think the international community can do to try to, you know, influence and strengthen those particular elements within the organization? And is, you think, using the kind of banner of ISKP as a threat, you know, the kind of right way to do that? Is it kind of, we work with them and say, look, this is a common enemy, let's work together, this will help strengthen you and help strengthen us and build the relationship? Or are there other ways that the international community kind of coax the Taliban further in these sort of more moderate directions? And then I think we'll switch to some of these questions about the regional players. Okay.
So right now, interesting enough, there are about 5 or 6 embassies that have remained open in Afghanistan, despite the fact that there's no government that has been recognized yet because it hasn't been formed yet. And those embassies are basically all of the neighboring countries, more or less. plus Turkey and Qatar, that is playing a mediating role, an important mediating role right now. This shows that, as I had mentioned earlier, the Taliban overture towards these countries is paying off, basically. And most of these countries, including China, have already expressed an interest in having normal relations with the Taliban, regardless of what kind of government emerges, actually. And I think that Pakistan and Iran and Russia will also follow suit. So the question now is about Western nations, those who, until a few days ago, bankrolled 70% of Afghanistan's budget and expenditures, and have done so for the past 20 years, and the United States being the major contributor. They have also made some, sent some messages in the past few days, basically saying that they're watching. They you know, as I said, they have sort of outlined some conditions and some criteria for recognition and for assistance, and counterterrorism is obviously one emerging item in all of this, and especially in terms of fighting ICP or Al Qaeda, if that happens to be a threat again. So my view is that there are many lessons that we can apply here from the past. If you want to isolate the Taliban and you want to push them in a certain direction, and then they leave them with no option but to engage just with the region and the powers in the region, then you cut off all assistance. You cut off diplomatic ties and economic ties and development assistance, and isolate them, and then they have no other means but to go to those who want to deal with them. And so you might radicalize some elements, and you might even encourage some anti-Western elements to come back to Afghanistan, if they find a way to come back to Afghanistan, as we discussed earlier. And for the Taliban to, basically live in a secluded from the West. I think the best policy at this stage is to cautiously engage. And cautiously engage means take one step at a time. Do not focus on the humanitarian side of the needs that exist right now. Afghanistan is facing huge humanitarian problems, very severe, and shortage of food and shortage of all types of commodities. And the banking system has collapsed. The financial system has collapsed. There are no livelihoods. There are no salaries being paid at this moment. So it's a country with no government and no revenue and no production. And so that is a recipe for not only a humanitarian disaster, but also a recipe for a lot of other bad things that could emerge out of this situation. And I don't think we should push it in that direction. I think, as I said, take cautious engagement steps and provide the humanitarian assistance that is needed, and make sure that we provide, technical assistance where it's needed. For example, today Qatar and to some extent Turkey sent a team of technicians to reopen and reoperationalize Kabul airport. And I think that is a great initiative, because you need Kabul International Airport to be connected to the world and for people to come and go, and especially in the case of those Afghans or foreign nationals who still are in Afghanistan and need to be evacuated, for example. So you need to reopen these connections to the world. So my view is, do not isolate Afghanistan and do not punish the Taliban, because punishing the Taliban would push them towards other countries, but it would actually hurt the Afghan people. And the last thing we want to do after all these years is to further hurt the Afghan people.
Thank you. No, I think the humanitarian first does have to be, I think, the order of play for Afghanistan, a country that suffered a huge amount over the past decades. I wonder if we could go now into a little bit more detail on some of the regional powers in particular. And I wonder if we could start with Iran, which has got a very particular relationship with Afghanistan. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what kind of a role do you think you will see Iran playing, or what approach are we going to see Iran taking going forwards in engaging with the government, whatever Taliban-led government should eventually emerge?
Well, interesting enough, we have a sort of a new government still, 8 months old in the United States, and we have a new government in Iran. To some extent, policy may remain the same at some level, but I think that a new president and a new cabinet always bring some new ideas in the Iran context. It will be interesting to see how it's played out. And you have a new unannounced government in Afghanistan, and then you have a new dominant force in Afghanistan, and the end of 20 years of a Western presence in Afghanistan. So Iran has had 2 or 3 driving policy strategy considerations in regards to Afghanistan. Number one is the United States. Its relation with the United States, how it's impacted by Afghanistan, what's happening in Afghanistan and the wider region, and how does it help Iran, or how does it hurt Iran? And so it has always calibrated its policy towards Afghanistan from that U.S. angle. Now that the U.S. angle has disappeared from Afghanistan, but still remains the factor in Iranian-U.S. relations, I think Iranian views of Afghanistan are also shifting. And we have seen that shift take place over the last few years as they warm up to the Taliban. At one point, you remember in the 1990s, they almost went to war against each other. And Iranian diplomats were assassinated in northern Afghanistan. And the Shia-Sunni schism also emerged at times. But I think they have patched up things. And I think that Iran wants stability in Afghanistan. And the other factor for Iran are refugees. The Iranians, obviously, like the Pakistanis, would like to see a stop, a halting of Afghans leaving and crossing into Iran. They already have at least 2 to 3 million Afghans living in Iran, and others and thousands crossing through Iran to get to Turkey and to Europe. And that is a destabilizing factor for Iran. And the other factor has to do with drugs and narcotics, which has always been a concern for Iran, and a very complex issue because it involves a lot of money and profiteering. And the last issue obviously has to do with the kind of terrorism that Iran considers as a threat to it, and those are obviously the extreme Sunni groups and the sectarian groups, the anti-Shia sectarian groups that operate again in the Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran geography. So Iran has those concerns and would like to see a government that is broad-based in Afghanistan, because then some of its interests, it thinks, can be served through the participation of the Shia community of Afghanistan in the government. And we have to wait to see who these Shia representatives will be and what is their connection to Iran once the new government is formed. You want me to go to the next one?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think the next maybe 2 you can kind of cover together, maybe not. It would be, I think, China and Russia. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how you see them, and in particular, how you see the Taliban. I think that would be very interesting to hear a bit more about how you see the Taliban trying to engage with them in particular.
Sure. Again, the Taliban have spent the last few years developing and nurturing new relationships with Russia and China. Some of it via Pakistan, because of Pakistan's close relations with China and growing relations with Russia. Part of it because both of those countries, Russia and China, again, feel a need for having a stable Afghanistan. They consider a turbulent Afghanistan as being a threat to their security. There is not much of a refugee issue with China or Russia because there are very few Afghans who go north, even though there are some, but not the same scale as Iran and Pakistan. But there's the other two elements that do apply, especially to Central Asia and Russia, and that has to do with the drugs, the narcotics business, and smuggling through those routes, and the huge social impact that it has on Russia and then Western Europe, and obviously the terrorism issue. The terrorism issue in this case, Uzbekistan has its problems. Tajikistan has its own issues with certain elements that it considers a threat to its security. Turkmenistan not so much involved in these and sort of taking sort of a neutral role. But Russia itself obviously is very worried about the underbelly of what used to be the Soviet Union, and is very much focused on making sure that IS KP does not become a threat to Russian interests, not only just because of Afghanistan, but also because of the experience that they had in the Middle East and in Syria. So Russia has that dual vision on Afghanistan. And Russia obviously has a long history, positive and negative, in Afghanistan, and it knows that it will never again directly get involved, but also would like to see more trade, more business and investment opportunities in Afghanistan. Russia knows a lot about Afghanistan. Russia has all the maps for the minerals of Afghanistan, knows what's underground in Afghanistan. So it may have an incentive in trying to take advantage of that. China obviously is the new big player on the block. China over time has more of an interest in what happens in Afghanistan. Part of it has to do with Pakistan. Part of it has to do with CPEC and the connection, the BRI connection that it wants to see implemented at some point through Afghanistan and through Central Asia and Afghanistan. So there are two paths to BRI for China in the future. And China also has an interest in Afghan minerals and what lies underground, especially in the past. They have shown an interest in copper, and they have shown an interest in rare earth elements, and maybe others that we don't know yet. So, and I think China finally has an interest in wanting to make sure that ETIM, the Uyghur militant group that has a presence in that region again, apparently is contained, and that they expect the Taliban to make sure that ETIM does not pose a threat to China, and the Taliban seem to have given that assurance to China. So I expect warmer relations between China and the Taliban in the future.
Thank you. We've had a lot of really interesting detailed questions in. So I'll just briefly to close out the kind of the regional piece. And actually expand it. Well, one more I think I'll add in terms of international relations, which would be good to hear your particular thoughts about. But what about Pakistan? The relationship with Pakistan is a very complicated one. I know the two countries are deeply interlinked. For the Taliban in particular, Pakistan has been a place of support, but I also know there's all sorts of tensions. It doesn't, you read all sorts of papers and reports that have come out talking to Taliban, and you see that the relationship with Pakistan is not a smooth one. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of Pakistan's role and how the Taliban government will engage, and whether you think, it will be in lockstep, or whether there will be continuous tension, and how they will kind of express some independence if they want to.
Yeah. Well, Pakistan is going to be an extremely important player moving forward because of its relationship with the Taliban since the 1990s. Because of the fact that Taliban leadership, most of them lived in Pakistan, have business in Pakistan, whose families lived in Pakistan. Now they seem to have shifted to Afghanistan. So that linkage is going to end, apparently. But Pakistan also has a couple of other. The Afghan-Pakistan relationship also has a couple of other dimensions. One is historic, as it goes back to the creation of Pakistan, to colonial times when the Durand line was drawn, dividing the tribes between the Pashtun tribes between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the fact that no Afghan government has ever recognized that as an international border, even though we have diplomatic relations with Pakistan. So that has always been a sort of a cause for tension, especially from the Kabul side, and especially a tension that has also been initiated by Pakistani nationalists, Pashtun nationalists on the Pakistan side, who always have also taken advantage of this tension between Pakistan and Afghanistan and try to play both sides against each other at times and try to benefit from that for their own cause. So it's complex in that sense. But I think that both Afghans and Pakistanis are now, after all these years, looking for trying to solve this issue through talks and through an understanding, and maybe through an initiative that would be acceptable to both nations and to both governments. What role the Taliban are going to play in that is going to be interesting to see. What new ideas they may have on the issue of the Durand line. The other there are also issues that have to do with water sharing. We have always had issues with water sharing between Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran and Afghanistan. We solved most of our power sharing issue with Iran back in the 1970s, even though they haven't really been followed up properly and implemented properly. But with Pakistan, we need protocols that would regulate power sharing in a way that benefits both countries. There's a trade and transit issue because of Afghanistan being a landlocked country. It has, by international law, has to be given some kind of outlet to the sea. And so at times Pakistan has used that for leverage against Afghanistan. So we need to resolve that issue as well. The other factor, the one that I think has played an important role over the years, is the India-Pakistan relationship. The India-Pakistan historic, if you want to call it, or the crisis between the two countries and the tensions between the two countries since partition have been reflected in Afghanistan, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. It has taken on new shape, new forms. And over the last 25 years, it has become even more acute, in my opinion. We need to offer some ideas, diplomatic, political ideas as to how to protect Afghanistan from the tensions that both Pakistan and India have and continue to have, because it has hurt Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, I think it also has not benefited both India and Pakistan, really. If you really think about it, it has not helped their cause that much. So I hope that in the future, a new government in Afghanistan will try to take a distance somehow from that bilateral relationship that has existed for a long time. And otherwise, I think that with Pakistan, we need a new chapter. I think that Pakistan also needs a new chapter with us. And Pakistan also needs to go through its sort of paradigm shift and trying to imagine a new relationship with Afghanistan based on respect, and on respecting our independence and sovereignty, and focusing on economic integration, economic cooperation, regional integration, and benefiting the people of both countries.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of time, and we've still got a whole bunch of really interesting questions. I'm also conscious it's very late for you, Ambassador, so I know we want to try to keep the schedule to let you get on with your evening. But to maybe pick up a question on the kind of external relations again that has been asked, which really brings it home, I think, to our audience here, is the question around Southeast Asia. And one of our colleagues has asked that, you know, in 2019, a Taliban delegation conducted an informal meeting with the then Indonesian Vice President Yusuf Kala. Does the Taliban engage in similar policies with other Southeast Asian countries? And do you think there is going to be a concerted effort by the Taliban to reach out to Southeast Asian countries? And do you think there's, you know, do you think this is a particular region that's of interest? You've got a number of countries here with very large Muslim populations, a lot of Muslim heritage here. Do you think there's going to be that kind of outreach to Southeast Asia in particular? And what do you think that will look like?
I think the Taliban, and I can't speak for them, I don't speak for them, but I think the Taliban are interested, from what they say, in having good relations with all Muslim countries. They want, you know, they say they want good relations with everyone. They don't want to consider anyone as a foe. But the relationship that has evolved with Indonesia is very much connected to the peace process that we saw evolve over the past 3-4 years. The same way that Qatar played and continues to play a pivotal role and a constructive role, and as a mediator and as a facilitator, there are instances when Indonesia has also played that role, and the Taliban have called on Indonesia, and the Indonesians themselves have offered that facilitation to the Taliban and to the Americans as well. I don't see any reason why in the future a stable, peaceful, and legitimate government in Afghanistan would not have good, solid relations with all countries in Southeast Asia, but especially, of course, those that have religious ties to Afghanistan, and where there are even Afghan communities living there in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries in that region. And I think that that would benefit, you know, all of these nations. And also, we also know that part of Southeast Asia has been impacted by terrorism. We also know that there was a connection at one point to Afghanistan, not to Afghans, not to the country of Afghanistan, to the people of Afghanistan, but to international terrorist groups that had found a home in Afghanistan. So we know that there is a concern about terrorism, and we hope that that concern will be alleviated and that will be taken care of over time.
Thank you. To switch tack a little bit and talk a bit about kind of religion and religion within the context of Afghanistan. We've got two questions that kind of touch on this. I'm going to kind of merge them together. I think one is, you know, what is your sense of the current religious dynamics in Afghanistan in terms of the sort of Taliban's orientation, and how will they, you know, how are they going to manage the sort of Salafi, Sunni, moderate, Sharia, the Shia elements that exist in Afghanistan? How do you see them kind of navigating this in terms of governance of the country going forwards? And then sort of linked to this is, you know, do you think the Taliban will sort of use an end of times narrative in trying to consolidate its power and influence in the country? So talk us through a little bit about some of the religious dynamics and how you see them sort of going forward.
So a couple of elements of gradual change detected over the years have to do with the Taliban's seemingly acceptance of both the Shia jurisprudence, Jafari jurisprudence, as a reality of Afghanistan, giving the Hazara and Shia communities of Afghanistan equal footing with the Hanafi jurisprudence, which is the Sunni version in predominant, maybe about 80% of covering 80% of the country. So in the 1990s, the Taliban had a problem not only admitting to it, but also executing and allowing these communities to perform their jurisprudence the way that the country used to in the past. So there's a shift. The other thing that I detect in their rhetoric again in their claims and their literature is the fact that they are now also using patriotism and nationalism as a slogan. So they talk about the national duty to fight the occupying force. It's not just an Islamic duty. So yes, they look at it as a jihad, a holy war, but when you fight another Afghan, like they used to under the Islamic Republic a few days ago, it's very difficult to justify that in terms of a jihad. And it's not exactly the same as the communist period when jihad really had a more black and white meaning, because the other side actually came out in the first few years of their existence saying that we are a Marxist-Leninist government, and we basically saying that they are an atheist government, and so that really roused up the Afghan people, and the Mujahideen of the time in the 1980s used jihad as a very, very powerful tool. But in the past few years, the Taliban have had a problem using jihad as a tool, so this is why they also incorporated nationalism, saying that they also are doing this for the sake of Afghan independence and sovereignty. So the notions of sovereignty and independence in fighting an occupying force, as they claimed, also becomes a motivation. And so I think that religion overall is going to play a central role in Taliban governance. How they're going to balance it, and how are they going to incorporate different viewpoints and the diverse spectrum that Afghanistan represents is going to be a huge challenge and a very big test of whether the Taliban are going to succeed or not.
Thank you very much for that. I'm conscious we're pretty much at the end of time, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Basit to wrap us up for this session. But one very, very brief final question would be on COVID. What is very briefly the kind of the status of the sort of COVID pandemic in Afghanistan in particular? And then I think Basit will close us out.
I think that Afghanistan over the past 2 years was impacted pretty heavily by COVID. The government under Ghani didn't do a very good job. The international community tried to help to the extent that they could. Not many people were vaccinated, and they could not impose the rules and regulations on the population. So I think what we see is COVID still being a threat, but Afghans are coping with it without any regards to the precautions that have to be taken. So I hope that it's going to be less of a threat now on, but I don't have any data recently because we've been in a state of war basically, and a change of government, and there is no government right now to provide any services.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Omar Samad. You have been very patient, and I think we have covered most of the things. Thank you for patiently answering our questions and sharing your insights. Before I wrap up, I just want to mention two things. We'll be sharing the feedback form towards the end of the webinar. Please fill in and share your feedback with us. What would you like to see in future, or how can we improve? Also, we have shared a link of our database, Southeast Asia Militant Atlas. Please check it out, subscribe to it if you're interested in tracking how terrorist groups or incidents in Southeast Asian region are happening or evolving. It will help you in your research. It will help you stay updated. Now, to wrap up the webinar, it is needless to say that Afghanistan is a complex country, and it happens to be in a region which is even more complex. And then, there have been superpowers intervening and leaving. So as of now, things are complicated and up in the air, evolving. So for so many questions to which we tried seeking answers with Ambassador Omar Samad, only time will tell. As of now, we can make some informed guesses based on what we know in the past or based on the available information. What I want to prioritize, of all the things that Ambassador Omar Samad said is the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Afghans should not be punished for who is currently ruling. That's number one. Number two is Taliban. It looks like they have evolved, but the way they navigate divisions within their own organization between the hardliners and more moderate elements, how do they do that conversation within their organization vis-a-vis various other organizations, particularly the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is now positioning itself to poach their more hardline elements and continue to engage with the international community. I think that balance will be critical in determining the future of the Taliban as a movement and future of Afghanistan under the Taliban. Ambassador Omar Samad is very, very clear on the question of sanctuaries or foreign fighters moving to Afghanistan. It is difficult. It isn't as easy as it looks. Pakistan is one country, and then the way Pakistani states' own strategic calculus vis-a-vis these groups evolves will be important to determine whether they can make their way into Afghanistan from that country. Otherwise, coming from Iran or Central Asia, it is difficult. Al-Qaeda, he said, the remnants are there, but the organization isn't as vibrant as it was. The leadership is not there. So where do they go? Taliban would not like to see them, doing the same what they did in the 1990s, because that will hurt their efforts to get international recognition. Regional countries' role is important, as he said. So I think this is where Afghanistan is. We'll have to be patient, work with the regime, give them time, but at the same time, I think hold them accountable to their commitments. And I think that will be the key. I think that's where I end. Thank you very much, Ambassador Omar Samad, for joining us. And thank you to all those who signed up for the webinar. Do check out our future webinars as well. And as I said, give us your feedback and do check out the Southeast Asia Militant Atlas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.